Way back in November of 1965, deep in the central highlands of Vietnam, the very first major battle between the U.S. Army and the People's Army of North Vietnam kicked off. And what a clash it was. This brutal 5-day fight would go on to set the stage, define the tactics, and, tragically, predict the outcome of the entire Vietnam War.
And that right there brings us to the central puzzle of this whole thing. You see, when the guns finally went silent in the Ia Drang Valley, both the American commanders and the North Vietnamese commanders walked away absolutely convinced they had found the winning strategy. How is that even possible? Okay, let's get into it.
So the Americans showed up with this revolutionary new idea they called air mobility. Think of it as war at the speed of a helicopter. The whole concept was to use technology to just leapfrog over the jungle, drop troops anywhere they wanted on the battlefield, all while being covered by this massive umbrella of firepower from the sky. And Ia Drang? Well, this was going to be its first real-world test. So picture the scene. We're in the Chu Pong Massif, this really remote, rugged area right near the Cambodian border. And this wasn't just some small skirmish. No, this was the U.S. Army's brand new 1st Cavalry Division, the Air Cav, pitting its shiny new doctrine against some very disciplined, battle-hardened regulars from the North Vietnamese Army.
This whole battle really unfolded over 5 incredibly intense days, and it happened in 2 totally distinct phases. First, you had this desperate defense at a small clearing they called a landing zone, or LZ. This one was named LZ X-Ray. Then, just a day later, a completely catastrophic ambush went down a few miles away at a place called LZ Albany. 2 completely different kinds of fights that taught 2 completely different lessons.
Let's start with LZ X-Ray, because this would become the textbook example of the American way of war.
Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's guys basically landed right on top of what turned out to be thousands of enemy soldiers. I mean, within minutes of the first helicopters touching down, his battalion of about 450 men was completely surrounded, seriously outnumbered, and literally fighting for their lives.
So how did they manage to survive? Well, they were pinned down, so they formed this tight defensive circle and just called in the storm. Artillery shells rained down, fighter jets were dropping napalm, and for the first time ever in a close support role, huge B-52 bombers were carpet bombing the enemy positions. They held their ground by unleashing an absolutely unprecedented amount of firepower.
After 3 days of just vicious fighting, the U.S. claimed a tactical victory, and the numbers, well, they seemed to prove it. They came up with a kill ratio of nearly 10-to-1, meaning for every 1 American soldier killed, they estimated 10 North Vietnamese soldiers had died.
So for the American High Command, this was a huge deal. It looked like air mobility and overwhelming firepower worked. It fit perfectly into that data-driven analytical mindset of the Pentagon, led by guys like Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The formula looked simple. Just inflict so many casualties the enemy can't sustain it, and you measure that with body counts. They truly believed they had found the key to winning in Vietnam.
But just as the Americans were feeling confident, the battle took this horrifying turn. Let's shift over to LZ Albany, where the PAVN, the People's Army of Vietnam, had a response that would change everything. You see, the very next day, another battalion from that same 7th Cavalry Regiment was ordered to march on foot from LZ X-Ray to a new spot, LZ Albany.
And this just perfectly highlights the difference. At X-Ray, the Americans were in a defensive circle, a perfect setup to call in air and artillery support. But at Albany, they were all stretched out in a long line, marching through this tall elephant grass, completely, utterly vulnerable.
The North Vietnamese commander, Colonel Nguyen Hue An, he had learned the lesson from X-Ray. He ordered his men to get so close to the Americans that they were, in his words, hugging the belt. This tactic, fighting at point-blank range, it totally neutralized America's biggest advantage. I mean, you can't drop bombs on an enemy when he's tangled up with your own soldiers.
What happened next was just absolute chaos. The American column, which was over 500 yards long, got hit from the side and the front at the same time. The fighting was immediate. It was savage. It was incredibly confusing. This wasn't a battle of technology anymore. It was a desperate brawl with rifles, grenades, and bayonets in the tall grass.
These numbers, they really tell the whole story. In 3 days of really intense fighting at LZ X-Ray, 79 American soldiers were killed. But in just a few hours at LZ Albany, 155 were killed. That's almost double the number in a tiny fraction of the time. The North Vietnamese tactic, it worked with absolutely devastating effect.
The journalist Joe Galloway,
He was one of the only civilians there on the ground, and he later described the aftermath with this haunting phrase. It just captures the sheer carnage and total confusion of that ambush. A complete 180 from the seemingly clean, technological victory at X-Ray just days before.
So what happens when you have a clear victory and a devastating defeat in the same week? Well, both sides took the lesson that suited them best, and in doing so, they created the very blueprint that would define the next decade of war.
You can really see how the two completely different playbooks were written here. The U.S. doubled down on air mobility and a war of attrition, a war of spreadsheets and body counts. The North Vietnamese, on the other hand, perfected their strategy of close-quarters combat. They were fighting a war of endurance. For them, just surviving America's firepower and fighting to a draw, that was a huge political victory.
And that's exactly why this battle was so pivotal. The North Vietnamese learned that, yeah, they probably couldn't defeat the Americans in a head-to-head technological fight, but they could inflict a level of casualties that the American public just might not tolerate over the long haul. They proved to themselves they could stand and fight and survive.
So here's the bottom line. Ia Drang didn't really produce a clear winner. Instead, it gave both sides this fatal dose of confidence. It locked them into two opposing strategies, attrition versus endurance, that basically guaranteed a long, bloody, drawn-out war with no easy way out for anyone.
And that just leaves us with a final, pretty sobering thought. The Battle of Ia Drang really shows us the profound danger of finding the answers you want to find in the chaos of war. It makes you ask, what happens when a conflict kicks off not with uncertainty, but with two sides absolutely convinced they already know exactly how to win? The answer, tragically, was written in the decade of fighting that came next.